There's a specific sentence someone said to me that I still think about years later, more often than I probably should. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody yelled it. Nobody meant it as some kind of turning point when they said it. It was just a plain, quiet observation, the kind of thing said almost in passing by someone whose job is to notice things the person in front of them has stopped noticing about themselves, and it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples that took months to fully reach the edges. I want to pause here for just a second because I know some of what I've just described might be landing close to home for some of you, and I don't want to rush past it. If any part of this is resonating, take a moment, sit with it. There's no need to have an answer right now. But if you're the kind of person who finds these stories useful, who likes hearing how other people actually got through the parts of life that don't come with instructions, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before we go any further, because there's a lot more of this story left, and honestly, a lot more stories like it waiting after this one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, not in some abstract algorithm sense, though sure, there's that too, but in a more direct way. It tells me these stories are actually reaching people, actually landing somewhere, and that keeps me motivated to keep telling them honestly instead of dressing them up. I'll be honest, when I first started sharing pieces of my own life like this, I wasn't sure anyone would care, wasn't sure a story about an ordinary person going through an ordinary hard stretch of life would be worth anyone's time when there's no shortage of louder, flashier things competing for attention out there. But it turns out a lot of people are quietly hungry for exactly this, not spectacle, just honesty, just someone willing to say the true, unglamorous parts of a hard chapter out loud instead of skipping straight to the tidy resolution. So, if that's what's kept you listening this far, subscribing is a small thing that means a lot, and it makes sure you don't miss where this story goes, or the ones that come after it. All right, back to it, because there's a fair bit more to tell, and I don't want to leave you hanging on the part that comes next, which, honestly, is where things really started to shift. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting at a kitchen table that seats 4, and you're the only one who will ever sit at it again, and you know that, and the table knows that, and somehow the table being too large for one person is the thing that finally makes the whole weight of it land on you at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning when you've got nowhere to be and no reason to be there by any particular time. That's not a crisis. That's just breakfast for about 2 years, if you let the days go the way days go when you've stopped having any particular reason to organize them. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old, and 11 months ago I packed what fit into 2 bags, left behind a rented 1-bedroom in Bakersfield, California, that I'd been living in like a man waiting for something to happen, and moved to a small city on the southeastern coast of the Philippines called Dumaguete. And I did it on a social security check and a small pension that would not have kept me comfortable in California for another 12 months, without starting to make the kind of decisions you don't want to be making at 71 about which bill you let slide and which one you actually pay. Before I get into how all of that happened, if this kind of story matters to you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of this coming, and I have a feeling you're going to want to be here for it. My name is Wyatt Hughes. I spent 34 years working as an electrician, the last 18 of those as a foreman on commercial construction jobs in the Central Valley, which is work that does something specific to your body over time that you don't fully notice until you stop doing it, and everything you'd been ignoring suddenly has your complete and undivided attention. My knees told me to retire at 62. My savings account told me to wait until 67. I split the difference at 65, which felt like a compromise at the time, and started feeling like a mistake about 6 months later. Not because I missed the work exactly, but because I hadn't understood how much of what I thought of as my life had actually been the schedule, the alarm, the drive out to whatever job site we were running that week, the noise and the problem-solving and the specific satisfaction of leaving a place at the end of a day with something working that hadn't been working when you showed up that morning. I was married once, to a woman named Sandra, from 1983 until 2009, and that marriage ended not in any dramatic way, but in the slow, quiet way marriages sometimes end when two people have spent long enough being polite substitutes for genuinely connected and finally get around to admitting that to each other. We had one daughter, Claire, who lives in Portland now, and who inherited her mother's practical intelligence and my stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which makes her extremely effective and occasionally exhausting to talk to. Sandra and I stayed on reasonable terms after the divorce, the way you can when the ending isn't anyone's particular villain story, and she remarried a few years later, moved to Arizona, sends Claire birthday cards, has a life that appears, from the outside, to be genuinely fine. I don't have any complicated feelings about any of that. I've had years to look at it honestly, and what I mostly see is two people who should have figured out sooner what they eventually figured out later, and who both came out the other side okay, which is not the worst possible outcome for a marriage that didn't survive. What happened after retirement was less okay, at least for a while. I'd been renting in Bakersfield because buying anything in California at the prices the market had gotten to didn't make sense on what I had, and the rent on even a modest one-bedroom was consuming a portion of my income that made the math uncomfortable no matter how many times I ran it. I'd been careful with money my whole life, the way you tend to be when you grow up without much of it and spend your working years around other people who are also working for every dollar they see. So I wasn't in any kind of crisis, not yet, but I could see the direction things were trending. The Social Security was enough, combined with the pension, to be livable almost anywhere other than where I was. And that specific realization, almost anywhere other than where I was, sat with me longer than I expected it to. Claire called every Sunday. She was good about it, consistent the way she is about most things she decides matter, and she'd ask how I was doing in the careful way adult children ask that question when they genuinely want the real answer, but also understand that the real answer is probably going to require more from both of you than the available time allows. I told her I was fine. I was fine, in the technical sense of the word, meaning I was healthy, meaning nothing was acutely wrong, meaning I had food in the refrigerator, and a chair to sit in, and a television that worked, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot that I stared at more than I'd like to admit. Fine, in other words, the way a room with all the windows closed is technically a room. I had a neighbor named Dennis, who was the closest thing I had to a regular social interaction outside of the grocery store. Dennis was 68, retired from the county road crew, widowed about 4 years before I moved in, and he and I had fallen into the habit of sitting on the shared walkway outside our units most evenings around 5 with a beer, talking about whatever presented itself: local politics, baseball scores, whether the apartment complex was ever going to fix the gate that had been half open since December. Dennis was good company in the way uncomplicated people are sometimes the best company available. He didn't want anything from the conversation except the conversation itself, and neither did I, and for about a year that was genuinely enough. Then Dennis moved. His son in Sacramento had been asking him to come and be closer to the grandkids for years, and he finally said yes. And one Tuesday he loaded a rented truck, and I helped him carry the last few boxes, and we shook hands in the parking lot and said we'd stay in touch, which we have, sporadically, in the way men are sporadically in touch when the regular proximity that made the friendship possible is no longer there, and neither party is quite willing to admit how much of the friendship was really just geography. After Dennis left, the evenings got longer in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'm not someone who'd call himself a particularly social person. I spent most of my working life comfortable, being the guy who did the job, drove home, ate dinner, got up and did it again. I'd never been someone who needed a crowded house to feel okay. But there is a difference, I discovered, between choosing quiet and being handed it without any particular alternatives on offer. And I was being handed a version of quiet that was starting to feel less like peace and more like a preview of something I didn't want to keep looking at. I started reading online, the way you do when your real life has gone quiet enough that the screen becomes the most interesting thing in the room. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first, just following whatever held my attention, which turned out, after a few weeks of following that trail wherever it went, to be retirement and cost of living, and from there, international retirement, and from there, the Philippines specifically, which kept showing up in forum after forum as a place where Americans of modest income were living what sounded like actual, full, daily lives, not enduring, not waiting, not managing, actually living. I want to be honest about what I was reading, because I know what those forums can look like from the outside, like advertising material dressed up as testimonials, like paid enthusiasm dressed up as genuine experience. Some of it was exactly that, but some of it wasn't. And you can usually tell the difference if you're patient enough to read past the posts that sound like a travel brochure and get to the ones where somebody describes getting lost on the wrong jeepney or overpaying for an apartment because they didn't know the neighborhood yet, or eating something that didn't agree with them for 3 days because they were too proud to ask what was in it before they ordered it. The honest ones had problems in them. The honest ones sounded like people who'd actually moved somewhere new and were finding it out the hard way, which meant they'd also found the other things, the real things, the ones worth moving for. Dumaguete came up repeatedly, in a way I started to notice. It wasn't always the loudest recommendation, wasn't always at the top of whatever list someone was making, but it kept appearing in the posts from the people who sounded most honest, the ones describing a life that sounded genuinely livable rather than just financially attractive. It had a university, it had a real city center without being overwhelming in scale. It had an expat community, large enough to be visible, but not so large it had turned the place into a satellite version of wherever everyone had come from. It sat on the coast, with a mountain behind it. It had a climate that was warm, but consistently described as manageable, not the kind of heat that grinds you down over time. And it was, by every account I read, one of the more affordable cities in a country that was already more affordable than where I was sitting. I found a man on one of those forums whose username I've since forgotten, but whose posts I read in their entirety over 3 evenings, a retired contractor from Ohio named Dale, who'd been in Dumaguete for 6 years, and wrote about it with the specific, useful detail of someone who had no financial stake in making it sound good and no reputation to protect by making it sound bad. Dale described the markets, the hospitals, the actual cost of a decent rented apartment, the quality of internet if you needed it, the experience of navigating basic bureaucracy as a foreigner, the social mechanics of finding people once you got there. I sent him a message through the forum, expecting nothing. He wrote back within a day, asked a few specific questions about my situation, income, health, what kind of daily life I was imagining, and then gave me a response that was so directly honest it took me slightly off guard. He said Dumaguete would probably work for me, but that I needed to go first and see it before I made any permanent decisions, because the gap between reading about a place and actually living inside it was wide enough that no amount of online research would close it, and anyone who told me otherwise was selling me something. They came to visit eventually, and I could tell, the moment they landed, that they were nervous about exactly what they were going to find. having spent months imagining a version of my new life that was probably far bleaker than the reality actually turned out to be. I watched them do the thing I think every skeptical loved one does when they finally see something in person instead of hearing about it second-hand over occasional phone calls. The worry on their face slowly gave way, over the course of just a few days, to something closer to relief, and eventually something closer to genuine happiness on my behalf. Watching me move through an ordinary day in a life that clearly had real shape and real people in it, not the isolated, uncertain existence they'd apparently been quietly picturing all along. On the last night of that visit, sitting together somewhere quiet, they said something that stayed with me long after they'd flown home. Some version of admitting they'd expected to find someone lonelier, smaller, more diminished than the person actually sitting in front of them. I told them that was more or less exactly what I'd feared finding in myself too, in those uncertain early months, and that I understood completely why they'd worried the way they had. But I also told them, and meant it fully, that worry built on imagination rarely survives contact with the actual lived truth of a situation, and that I was glad they'd finally gotten to see the truth of it for themselves, instead of continuing to worry about a version of my life that had never actually existed. I called Claire that Sunday and told her I was thinking about taking a trip to the Philippines to look at a city called Dumaguete. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that I recognized as her processing something she hadn't expected and taking a moment before she said the wrong thing, which is a very Claire response, thoughtful, where I'd have been immediate. She asked, carefully, what the purpose of the trip was, and I told her honestly that the purpose was to find out whether it was somewhere I could afford to actually live, rather than somewhere I was just surviving. Another pause. She asked who I knew there. I told her I'd been corresponding with a man on an online forum for about 2 weeks, and that he'd offered to show me around if I came. She asked whether I understood how that sentence had sounded, and I told her I understood entirely, and that I was going anyway. What followed was a conversation that lasted almost an hour, and that covered healthcare and distance, and what would happen if something went wrong, and whether I understood that she couldn't just get in her car and drive to me, and whether I'd thought about any of this seriously. I told her I'd thought about almost nothing else for the better part of 3 months. I told her the financial math in California wasn't working and was going to stop working more completely in the near future if I didn't do something about it. I told her I was 70 years old and still fully capable of getting on a plane and making a decision about my own life, and that she could be worried about it and still support me making it, and that both of those things were allowed to be true at the same time. As she was quiet for a moment at that and then said, "You've already decided, haven't you?" I said I'd decided to go look. She said that was the same thing with me, and she wasn't wrong. I booked a 3-week trip. Dale met me at the airport in Dumaguete on a Tuesday afternoon and drove me to the guest house I'd arranged not far from Rizal Boulevard, the long promenade that runs along the coastline. And on that first drive, I saw the boulevard itself for just a few minutes through the car window before we turned inland. Just a wide walkway along the water with the late afternoon light on it, and people moving at the particular pace of people who aren't particularly hurrying anywhere. And something about that image stayed with me longer than I expected. Something about the pace of it, the absence of urgency, the way the whole waterfront seemed to exist at a human speed I hadn't seen in a long time. Dale took me to dinner that first evening at a small place near the University District, a neighborhood he called Silliman, after the American university that had sat in the middle of Dumaguete for over a century, lending the whole area a kind of low-key, bookish energy that I hadn't fully anticipated finding in a coastal city in Southeast Asia. Over dinner, he gave me a very practical, non-romantic introduction to the city as it actually was, not as anyone trying to sell me something would have described it. He told me about the two main hospitals, that one of them, a medical center associated with the university, was genuinely capable of handling most things a person my age would need handled, and had a reputation among the local expat community as reliably competent. He told me about the produce market near the pier, that it was cheaper than anywhere else, and worth the slightly complicated navigation of getting to it and finding your bearings the first few times. He told me about the areas worth living in and the areas where the noise or the flooding in wet season would eventually wear on you. He told me the things that would frustrate me: slow bureaucracy, internet that occasionally did what it wanted rather than what you needed, traffic patterns that operated by rules he hadn't fully decoded even after 6 years. And he told them to me without apology, as facts I should factor in, not problems I should be discouraged by. I spent the first week just moving through the city with and without Dale, learning the basic geography, which took less time than I expected because Dumaguete is genuinely not a large or complicated city, the kind of scale where you can walk from one end of the central area to the other in a reasonable amount of time and actually start to feel like you know where you are after just a few days rather than weeks. I'd go early, before the heat built, and there'd be other people out doing the same thing. Locals mostly, some foreign faces, a mix of ages, joggers and couples and older men sitting on the benches watching the water and the outline of Cebu visible across the strait on clear mornings. And I fell into the rhythm of it with a speed that surprised me, the way you fall into a rhythm that was waiting for you rather than one you're inventing. I met Dale's friend group in pieces over that first week. There was a man named Phil who'd been in Dumaguete for 8 years, retired from a logistics company in Texas, who had the specific dry humor of someone who'd spent decades managing complicated problems and had reached the point in life where he no longer found any problem sufficiently complicated to get particularly worked up about. Phil had a regular table at a small restaurant on the boulevard, where he and a rotating group of expats and local friends gathered most evenings around 6, and Dale brought me along on the 3rd evening of my trip and introduced me with the brevity of a man who trusted that I'd figure out the rest myself. What I found at that table was something I'd been trying to name for most of the trip: a room, or in this case a table, where nobody had to explain themselves from the beginning, because everyone at it had already made some version of the same choice and already understood the basic shape of the reasoning. I didn't have to justify why I was there, or defend it against the concerns of someone who hadn't been where I was sitting, because the people at that table had all been sitting there, in one form or another, before they ended up at this particular table in this particular city. There was a man named Art who'd been a middle school history teacher in Indiana for 30 years, retired at 63, and who was now, in his 8th year in Dumaguete, teaching a twice-weekly informal history discussion at a small community space he'd set up with a local partner, open to whoever showed up, which apparently included everyone from university students to retired teachers from the local school system who wanted something to argue about in the afternoons. Art was 68 and had the energy of someone who'd spent 8 years being energized by something he'd found accidentally and was still slightly surprised by it every day. He told me, over a bottle of Red Horse that first evening, that he'd originally planned to stay a year, just to see, and that the year had turned into 8, without his quite deciding at any specific point that it would, and that he attributed most of that to the fact that the city had given him something to do that mattered to someone other than himself, which was, in his words, the only retirement plan that actually works. There was a woman at that table too, which I mention because the forum research had given me an impression of these expat gatherings as predominantly male spaces, and Dumaguete's version turned out to be somewhat more mixed than I'd expected. Her name was Joy, and she was not a foreign retiree, but a local woman in her 60s who'd worked for the university for most of her career, and had become, over the years, something like an unofficial advisor to newcomers from abroad, the person who understood both sides of the cultural gap well enough to navigate it in either direction, and who showed up at Phil's table precisely because it amused her to be useful to people who were still in the process of figuring out what questions to ask. Joy told me, the first time we spoke, that the most common mistake she saw foreigners make in Dumaguete was trying to recreate their life from home rather than allowing themselves to have a different one, and that the ones who stayed longest and seemed happiest were the ones who arrived with less certainty about what they expected and more willingness to be surprised by what they found. I sat with that for most of the rest of that evening. I found the apartment situation in Dumaguete to be exactly as Dale had described, manageable, with real options at prices that required me to recalibrate my expectations in the opposite direction from what years in California had trained me for. I spent my second week looking at places, sometimes with Dale's guidance and sometimes on my own, and what I found was that for somewhere between 12,000 and 18,000 pesos a month, roughly $215 to $320 at the exchange rate I was working with, I could rent a clean, modern, properly maintained apartment with air conditioning and reliable plumbing, and that for a few thousand pesos more, I could get something with a view worth having. I looked at 6 places over 4 days, some that worked and some that didn't. One that seemed promising online and was less promising once you'd stood inside it for 10 minutes and noticed what the listing photos had been careful not to show you, and eventually settled in my mind on a type rather than a specific unit. A ground floor or low floor place in the Silliman district or close to the boulevard, furnished with a kitchen I could actually use, in a building with a landlord who'd been managing foreign tenants long enough to understand what that specific relationship required. The cost of living beyond rent was the part that most of my online research had described accurately, but that I still needed to see with my own eyes before I fully believed it. I bought groceries at the public market and at a nearby supermarket and compared them. I ate at small local restaurants, carinderias, the open front places where a full meal of rice and 2 dishes came to something between 60 and 80 pesos, $1 or a little over, and at the slightly more tourist-facing places along the boulevard where the price was higher, but still, by any California reference point, almost invisible. I bought a few things I needed from the hardware store near the market, just to calibrate the general economy, and found that the prices for basic goods existed in a register that my California brain kept trying to double-check because they didn't seem quite possible, and they kept being possible, and eventually I stopped double-checking. I went to see the hospital. This was my own idea, not Dale's suggestion, though he drove me and introduced me to someone who knew the administration, which smoothed things considerably. I wanted to look at the actual facility, not because I had any particular medical concern at that moment, but because I'd promised myself, and more or less promised Claire, that I would make this decision with both eyes fully open and not paper over the parts that needed honest evaluation with wishful thinking. What I found was a properly equipped hospital that handled a full range of care, had surgical capacity, had intensive care facilities, had working equipment, and, according to Dale and Joy both, a staff with a solid reputation for competence and genuine patient care. It was also not what I'd feared, which was a situation where getting adequately treated for anything serious would require a medical evacuation to Manila or beyond. For the kinds of things a 71-year-old man might realistically need, handled in the short to medium term, it seemed genuinely capable. I filed that information where it needed to go, in the honest accounting I was keeping, next to the costs and the distances and everything else I was promising myself I was seeing clearly. The thing I hadn't fully accounted for in all my reading was what it would feel like to be in Dumaguete as a specific kind of person, in a specific stage of life. I mean the emotional dimension of it, separate from the financial and logistical math, which I'd been mostly focused on because the math was the presenting problem. I was 70 years old, recently retired, alone in the sense that mattered most, with a daughter 800 miles from where I'd been, and a social life that had consisted primarily of beers with a neighbor who'd since moved away, and Sunday phone calls that were warm but were not, in the end, daily contact with another human being who was glad to see me. That was the real situation underneath the financial situation, the one I hadn't quite found the language for before I got on the plane, but that I was starting to find language for now, that I was somewhere new and had to reckon with what I'd actually been living. Dumaguete did something I hadn't anticipated, which was that it made it slightly difficult to remain invisible. The city is small enough and has enough of an active pedestrian life along the boulevard and around the university area that if you show up somewhere regularly, people notice. If you go to the same stall at the market twice, the woman running it will recognize you the third time. If you walk the boulevard most mornings, you will start to see the same faces and they will start to see yours. There is a social texture to daily life there that requires some participation whether you intend to participate or not. And for someone who'd been sliding into invisibility in a California apartment, that texture was something I hadn't known I needed and couldn't have identified before I felt the difference. I finished the 3 weeks and flew home, with the decision already made, though I spent another 5 months making the practical arrangements before I actually left. I needed to close out the apartment lease in Bakersfield, which involved timing and some negotiation. I needed to set up banking that would work from abroad, which involved more research than I expected, and a few calls with a financial advisor who had some experience with clients living internationally, and who helped me think through the structure of getting my Social Security deposited in a way I could actually access without losing a significant portion of it to fees every month. I needed health insurance that would cover me living abroad, an international plan built for long-term expatriate retirees, one that covered hospitalization and major procedures, and, critically, medical evacuation if something happened that required care beyond what was locally available. Because that was the specific question Claire had asked most directly and most reasonably, and I wanted an answer that held up to scrutiny rather than one I'd assembled out of optimism. I also needed to apply for the Special Resident Retirees Visa, the SRRV, which is a program the Philippine government runs specifically for foreign retirees, and which, once you have it, gives you indefinite residence, rather than requiring you to manage visa renewals on a recurring basis. The application process required documentation, some of it straightforward, and some of it requiring more time and coordination than I'd initially estimated, and I won't pretend it was without frustration. There were moments during those 5 months when the practical complexity of what I was trying to do made me wonder whether I was making it harder than it needed to be, or whether this was genuinely the level of difficulty involved, and I just needed to push through it. Dale was helpful in that period, in ways that went beyond what any forum post could have been, answering specific questions based on specific experience, which is a different thing entirely from general advice. Telling Claire the formal decision was different from telling her I was considering it or going to look. I called her on a Sunday, our regular time, and told her I was going. I tried to pre-answer the questions I knew were coming by walking through each piece of the practical arrangement I'd made. The insurance plan and its specific coverage, and the company's contact number, the banking setup, the SRRV application, the hospital I'd visited and what I'd found there, the names and contact information for Dale and Phil and Joy, real people she could call or email if she ever needed to reach someone on the ground quickly. I told her what the rent was going to be, and what food cost, and what the math looked like compared to what the math in Bakersfield had been looking like. And I let her sit with the numbers for a moment, because the numbers were where I'd started, and they were still the most straightforward part of the argument. She was quiet through most of what I said, in the listening way rather than the withholding way, and when I finished, she asked me one question I hadn't fully prepared for. She asked whether I was doing this because I genuinely wanted to live there, or because I was trying to escape living in Bakersfield. I told her that was a fair distinction, and that I'd thought about it, and that the honest answer was that it started as the second thing and became the first thing somewhere during that 3-week trip, and that I wasn't sure the starting point mattered as much as where you ended up, but that I understood why she was asking. She was quiet again for a moment, and then said she wanted to come visit in the first 6 months. Not to evaluate my decision, she clarified immediately, but because she wanted to see it. I told her I'd hold her to that. I landed in Dumaguete on a Wednesday afternoon, in the middle of what passed for cooler season, which in a coastal tropical city means the heat is present, but the humidity had backed off enough to be breathable rather than oppressive, and Dale was there to pick me up in a car that still had a small crack in the windshield that had been there when I visited 3 weeks into my first trip, which was somehow a comforting kind of continuity. The apartment I'd arranged was ready, a 2-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor of a small building 6 blocks from the boulevard, furnished with the specific combination of adequacy and neutral taste that most furnished rentals manage. Nothing you'd have chosen yourself, but nothing you needed to argue with either. The rent was 16,000 pesos a month. The landlord, a man named Rolando who lived on the ground floor, had been renting to foreigners for years and operated with the particular calm of someone who'd already encountered every variation of the new tenant settling in process, and wasn't especially worried about any of it. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, and I say that as someone who'd prepared for them to be hard. There is a specific kind of disorientation that comes from arriving somewhere you've decided to make your life, and discovering that the decision doesn't automatically translate into knowing how to actually live there. I knew the boulevard, and I knew the route to Dale's regular table, and I knew where the supermarket was, and beyond those coordinates, the city was still largely unmapped in the personal way that makes a place feel like yours, rather than just a place you're in. I got turned around in the market twice. I misjudged the jeepney routes, and ended up somewhere other than I'd intended, and had to work out where I was from first principles, which took longer than I wanted it to, and was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of problem that starts to feel like an adventure once it's resolved, but absolutely doesn't feel like an adventure while you're in the middle of it, standing on an unfamiliar corner, trying to figure out which direction the water is. I found my way. That's the less dramatic but entirely accurate version of the first month. I found my way through a combination of Dale's patience, Joy's practical guidance, the specific kindness of Rolando who answered questions at all hours without apparent irritation, and my own stubborn refusal to let confusion harden into defeat, which is probably the most useful personality trait I've ever had in situations where the alternative was giving up. There was a woman named Ate Nori, who ran a small food stall 3 blocks from my building, selling a rotating selection of whatever she'd cooked that morning. And I found her on my 5th day, when I was hungry, and didn't feel like navigating the further walk to anywhere I already knew. I pointed at what looked good, and she handed me a container of rice and something I later identified as chicken adobo, vinegar braised in a way that produced a flavor I was not fully prepared for, deeply savory and a little sharp, and entirely unlike anything I'd had before. And I stood there on the street eating it, and decided, with the particular clarity you sometimes get over unexpectedly good food, that this was not a mistake. The situation I was in was not a mistake. The decision that had landed me on this street with this food on a Thursday morning was not a mistake. 8 Nori charged me 60 pesos for the whole thing and threw in a small bag of salted crackers without explanation, and I went back the next day and the day after that, and within 2 weeks she was putting aside the chicken adobo specifically for me before it sold out, which I discovered by accident when I showed up mid-morning and she immediately produced it from somewhere behind the counter before I'd opened my mouth. Phil's evening table became my most reliable social anchor in those first months. I went most evenings, sometimes with Dale and sometimes alone, and I found what I think a lot of people find in a gathering like that, which is that the regularity of it matters almost more than any individual evening. That knowing there will be people at a specific table at a specific time who are expecting you in the loose, non-demanding way of people who are glad when you show up and not particularly worried when you don't, creates a different kind of steadiness than you'd think, the kind that comes from being expected rather than needed, which I mean as a compliment to both states. Art brought me to one of his informal history discussions about 3 weeks after I arrived, just to see it, he said, no expectation of participation. I lasted about 12 minutes before I was involved in a discussion about the labor movement in early 20th century America with a university student named Marco, who had strong opinions and the debating energy of someone who'd never met someone who'd been alive during the period under discussion and intended to make full use of it. Art watched this from across the room with the specific enjoyment of a man who'd seen exactly this happen before and was delighted to be right about predicting it again. I went back twice more in the following month and then stopped counting and just started showing up. The discussions were genuinely good, uneven the way discussions are when the participants range in age and formal education and background, but good in the way that uneven things are sometimes good, with an unpredictability that kept you leaning forward rather than settling back. I found myself preparing for them the way I hadn't prepared for anything in years, reading things in the days before each session, making notes, not out of any obligation, but out of that particular appetite you feel when something has given you a reason to think carefully about something other than your own situation. It was through one of those discussions that I met a young woman named Precious, a second-year university student studying economics, who had the most specific and well-developed skepticism of any person I'd met in years, regardless of age. Precious argued with me about American labor history with a precision that suggested she'd done more primary source reading on the subject than I had, which was entirely possible and entirely humbling, and after the discussion she asked me, without any particular preamble, whether I'd be willing to help her think through a research paper she was working on about retirement economics in the United States, specifically the structural reasons why so many American retirees found themselves financially constrained in later life. I said yes before I'd entirely thought it through, because the subject was one I had some personal authority to speak to, and because something about her directness reminded me of Claire at that age, certain and curious, and not especially interested in softening either quality for the comfort of people around her. What started as one conversation about a research paper became something more extended over the following weeks. Precious was working on a longer project, ultimately aimed at a scholarship application for a graduate program, and the paper on American retirement economics was one piece of it. I helped her think through the argument structure, pointed her toward sources I knew from my own reading, sat with her at a small cafe near the university for what turned out to be 3-hour sessions that neither of us had planned to be 3 hours long, talking through the logic of things that had mattered to me personally and that she was examining from the outside as a system to understand and critique. Helping her think through that scholarship application, the specific essay arguing why her research mattered and what she intended to do with it, was the kind of work I hadn't done in years and hadn't known I missed until I was doing it again. The work of taking something that actually mattered and trying to help it be expressed as clearly as it deserved to be. She submitted the application in my 3rd month in Dumaguete, and I spent the 10 days between submission and result in a state of low-grade anxiety that I recognized, with some amusement, as the anxiety of someone who cared about an outcome they had no control over, which I hadn't felt about anything external to myself in quite some time. She got the scholarship. She knocked on my apartment door at 7:30 in the morning, holding a printout of the acceptance email, and I read it twice because I wasn't fully awake yet and needed to make sure I understood it correctly, and then I shook her hand, which she seemed to find both insufficient and charming, and I went and made coffee, and we sat at my small kitchen table for an hour while she talked through what came next, which she'd clearly been planning for longer than the scholarship application had been in process. I sat across from that conversation and thought, not for the first time since I'd moved here, that this was what art had meant by having something to do that mattered to someone other than yourself. Not a grand description of purpose, not a formal program with a name, just a person across a table whose situation was genuinely different because of something you'd contributed, and your knowing it, and that being enough. About 6 months into being in Dumaguete, I had a morning where I woke up before the alarm, which I'd been setting mostly out of habit rather than necessity, and lay there in the early quiet of the apartment and realized, with a clarity that felt slightly editorial, in the way those moments sometimes do, that I hadn't woken up dreading the day in a long time. Not in Dumaguete, not in months. I had dreaded days in Bakersfield. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have presented clinically as anything, just the low, flat dread of days that didn't have anything in them you were particularly glad to be doing. That was gone. I could feel its absence, the way you can feel the absence of a low-grade headache you'd gotten so used to that you'd forgotten you were having it until it stops. I want to be precise about what Dumaguete actually is for someone in my situation, because I think imprecision does a disservice to people who might be trying to honestly evaluate whether it would work for them. It is not paradise. It is not a solution to grief or loss or loneliness that operates automatically upon arrival. It is not a place where the problems of being human are somehow suspended. The heat can be genuinely difficult for certain months, and the humidity with it. There are administrative frustrations that you learn to plan around, and that will occasionally get past your planning and arrive as unexpected complications. The traffic near the market on busy mornings is its own specific puzzle. There are things available in an American city at 2 in the morning that are not available in Dumaguete at all, services and conveniences that you get used to not having faster than you'd expect, but that take some adjustment. The distance from family is real, and while technology makes it manageable, it doesn't make it nothing. And anyone who tells you the distance doesn't matter is either at the beginning of their experience or telling you what you want to hear. What it is, honestly, is a city where a person of modest retirement income can afford to live with dignity and genuine daily pleasure, in an environment that encourages being out in the world rather than sealed inside a small apartment waiting for costs to stop rising. That is not a small thing. That is, for someone in the financial position I was in and the social position I was in, the entire thing. Claire came in my 5th month. I picked her up from the airport in a car that Dale arranged, because the drive from the Dumaguete airport is short enough that I've learned to do it myself now, but at that point I was still working on the confidence. And she stepped out of the terminal into the warmth of the evening and looked around with the expression of someone calibrating, taking in information before deciding what to do with it. She'd been nervous on the flight, she told me later, in the way adult children are nervous about seeing a parent in a situation they haven't fully made peace with, braced for some version of a father she'd be worried about, rather than one she'd simply be glad to see. I took her to dinner on the boulevard that first evening, at a restaurant with a view of the water and Cebu across the strait, and I let the city speak for itself, the way I'd learned Dale had let it speak for me on my first trip, not overselling it, not building the case, just letting her be inside it and see what she noticed. What she noticed, she told me much later, was that I talked about the people in my days, Ate Nori and Art and Precious and Phil and Joy, the way she'd heard me talk about projects on job sites years ago when the work was good and I was engaged by it, with the specific animation of someone who is genuinely interested in the details of what they're describing, rather than filling air with sound. She spent a week. She walked the boulevard with me in the mornings. She met Dale and Phil at the regular table, and spent an evening being thoroughly charmed by Joy, who could charm anyone she chose to, and generally chose to. She came to one of Art's history discussions and was quietly astonished to find me at the center of an argument about the New Deal with a room full of people ranging in age from 19 to 68, holding my own in a way that apparently registered differently in person than it had when she'd imagined me retired in California, finding very little to hold my own about. She met Precious on the second to last day of the visit. Precious brought her a copy of the finished scholarship essay, which she'd printed and bound with slightly excessive formality, and explained in her characteristic direct way what my contribution to it had been. Not over-attributing it, but stating it specifically, describing the argument improvements and the structural work and the sourcing conversation in the same precise language she used for everything. And Claire listened to this with the expression of someone receiving information that was adjusting a calculation she'd been running. When Precious had gone, Claire was quiet for a moment, and then said, "She reminds me of me, a little." I told her I'd thought the same thing from the first conversation. She thought about that for a while. On her last morning, we sat. If any part of this sounds like where you are right now, sitting somewhere quiet, wondering what's actually left to look forward to, I hope this gave you something to hold on to, even if it's small. It doesn't have to look like what I did. It doesn't have to be dramatic or far away or anything close to what you're picturing right now as you sit with this. But I do think it has to be something, some door you're willing to walk through even while you're not entirely sure what's waiting on the other side of it, because certainty, in my experience, almost never arrives before the decision does. It arrives after, once you've already taken the step and given yourself enough time to see what it actually leads to. I wish someone had told me that plainly years ago, instead of leaving me to wait around for a certainty that was never going to show up first. So if you're waiting for that certainty before you let yourself change anything, I gently suggest you might be waiting for something that simply doesn't come in the order you're expecting it to.